Good evening, sir, and good to see you tonight. I've got your favourite seat waiting there by the fire, alongside some tobacco and your customary glass of whiskey. But I gather you want something else, and... Oh, of course! More tales of competitive chivalry from the old world. Well, I've got something good in store for you tonight, because it's not just one battle report, but 5. So I'm going to tell you about the latest joust of Chantal the Prophetess and her merry men of Bretonnia, and their little trip down to the salubrious venue of Firestorm Games in Cardiff for their umpteenth attempt to put some silverware in the King's cabinet. So it's another one of these 5-round tournaments, and let me tell you what my list was. So my general once again is Chantal the Prophetess, a level 4 wizard on Heavens. She's carrying the Power Stone for an extra secret kick to one of her spells, and also the Ruby Ring of Ruin, which lets me cast a Fireball as a bound spell on a 3-up. Then we've got the Green Knight with his ethereal, coming back to life, teleporting shenanigans, and this time he's got 3 hours to really screw around with the opposition, so I'm expecting a very good performance from him. Moving into heroes, we've got Repance the Leoness, the Battle Standard Bearer. Now, some will remember Repance as a legendary 5th edition special character. Bit of a travesty that there were no rules for her in the 6th edition army book, but I've got the model, and what a splendid one it is, and she's going to be carrying the army's battle standard. All she's got is a lance and a shield. Next we've got 3 Pegadins, and these are really some of the central idea behind this list. 3 Pegasus heroes. So, that guy there in red and blue, that's Sir Gaston. He's got the Tress of Isolde, the Virtue of Knightly Temper, a lance, and the Gromwell Greathelm. This means he's got a 2-up rerollable armor save and can do one really nasty charge that forges extra attacks by popping the Tress of Isolde. Next on the green Pegasus, we've got Sir Michel, who's got the Worm Lance, which does a sort of a single strength 3 breath weapon, a Dawnstone, and an enchanted shield, also a 2-up rerollable armor save. And then finally, the only very slightly inferior Sir Pierre, who has a Luck Stone and the Dragon Helm to give him a single 2-up rerollable armor save. Against certain opposition, these 3 flying Pegadins that are quite hard to take down should give the enemy absolute nightmares. And then last but by no means least, we've got Miss Universal herself, Marie, who is a level 2 wizard, this time on the Law of Light, riding a horse, and she's got a Dispel Scroll. On to the core, and we've got 6 Knights of the Realm with full command, there in red. To the left of them, in the green and yellow, and the blue, 2 units of 6 Knights Errant with full command. And then to the left of them, 2 units of 5 Knights Errant, only with champions. Finally, standing immediately behind Chantal, the merry men themselves, 10 skirmishing peasant bowmen. For special, we've got 2 Grail Reliquaries pushed by 6 Battle Pilgrims. Now, these are a very interesting choice. They're stubborn, they've got hatred, and they can fight in a very interesting, slightly gamey kind of formation, with the Grail Reliquary going at the front and the Battle Pilgrims going behind. These are nasty little stubborn road bumps. I'd never really seen them used before, but in my game against Drew, who is also a Bretonnian player, I was very impressed with the performance of his one, so I decided to paint up no less than 2 myself and take them to this tournament. To top off the list in the rare slot, we've got 3 Grail Knights, which is the minimum unit size you can field, and then the mandatory 2 Trebuchets, hoping for a much better performance than they've been putting in recent times. For those interested in the comp system, which is designed to be a balancing mechanic to help curtail powerful armies and reward weaker ones, this list works out as an, in my view, extremely stingy +4, so still softer than average even by that system. Now this army has a very distinct philosophy behind it, because it's a very big departure from the traditional kind of Bretonnian list where you'll normally see 3 very long lances for breaking opposition infantry formations. I've almost gone kind of postmodern with my Bretonnians, which is to say, I've kind of given up on the prospect of being able to break opposition infantry, simply because there's so much stubborn and so much unbreakable in fantasy nowadays that probably you're going to get 1 or 2 games that you can't really win. So I've gone the other way, and I've gone for lots of multiple smaller units of knights. I've also got those 3 Pegadins as well, which are lightning fast. The knights are going to skirt around, pick my fights, kill the things that I can kill, and ignore all the stubborn, unbreakable Death Stars that are going to be thundering in the middle of the table. The 2 Grail Reliquaries, in the meantime, are there to hold things that I don't want to fight up. The other reason why I'm trying this kind of list in this setting is 2 reasons. First, there are missions in this tournament, and these are various ones which usually relate to capturing objectives on the board, and I'll describe them as we move from game to game. There are 20 points available per round, and the missions are worth 6, so very important when it comes to scoring. A really fast army like this is very good at capturing these kind of objectives. There are a lot of standard bearers in this army, which you need to be able to score, and yes, those Grail Reliquaries count as standard bearers as well. The second reason I'm trying this out is because we've got 3-hour rounds at this tournament, something I absolutely love. This means you can play this more precise, more finessed kind of approach, where a lot of the time you're going to be outmaneuvering your opponent, fleeing and trying to pick your fights. All that just takes a bit more time. Righto, enough of that admin, let's get on to the games themselves. And my first one here is against Adam West's Tomb Kings. Now, Tomb Kings, of course, probably the weakest army in Warhammer Fantasy, but in this tournament they've got some serious buffs. To start with, the whole army gets +3 on the comp score, something Bretonnians used to get in the old days, but no longer. And then they get an extra 250 points as well. And then thirdly, they're allowed to pick a particularly ridiculous kind of monster called the Khemric Titan, and we'll come on to him in a minute. So, this is Adam's army, and you'll see there are 2 huge blocks of chariots. Now, these Tomb King chariots, if they charge, of course these units will hit like a ton of bricks, but I'm fairly confident I ought to be able to get the charge on them. I've got plenty of things that can chaff him, I've got lots of different charges. If I can even charge a single Pegadin into one of those chariot units, I ought not to lose combat, so I feel quite confident about those. They're also very unmanoeuvrable. He's got 2 Tomb Princes on chariots, riding in the unit, the obligatory Casket of Souls, a fairly big unit of Tomb Guard, which are very dangerous against Bretonnians because they've got Killing Blow, the customary level 4 on the Law of Nekara, who are going to go in a unit of archers that my opponent hasn't put on the table yet, a Necrotect to give those Tomb Guard hatred, and then finally a Mummy Tomb King to give them an extra punch in combat. And then finally you've got that thing there on the right. That is the Khemric Titan, of which there were no less than 3 or even 4 of at this tournament. So I could go on a very extended essay about this unit, but I'll keep it brief. So it's got toughness 8 and strength 8, 10 wounds and a 3-up armor save. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It's then got a 2d6 Thunderstomp at strength 8, and it can Thunderstomp everything, including cavalry and other monsters. Even without its other attacks, that's a Dead Knight unit guaranteed every combat phase, almost certainly. If that wasn't enough, it does other things in combat as well, and also has magic spells. It also can't be physically wounded by anything that isn't strength 4, and even strength 10 hits only wound it on a 3+. Oh yeah, and it can fly as well. I have never seen anything, and I do not think we'll ever see anything as powerful as this on any gaming table. Thank goodness it's only a part of the weakest army in Warhammer Fantasy. But with an extra 250 points in the hutch, these things I think are a must-take for the Tomb Kings. Anyway, this guy's public enemy number 1. There's very little indeed I can do about him. Yeah, I've got 2 Trebs, but if I spend all the battle shooting at him, I only wound him on a 3, and I've got to get really lucky with my hitting and my multiple wounds. I might well wound him 5 or 6 times and let the entire rest of the army off the hook, so I'm not sure he's a great target, especially given how fast he is. Now I do have the Green Knight, and if I can get the Green Knight into combat with that Titan, he might be able to tie it up for most of the game. The Titan's attacks aren't magical generically and so can't wound the Green Knight, but some of his random effects are and could topple the champion in just a single round if I'm unlucky. Right, so here's the setup, and the objective for this scenario is capturing a piece of terrain. I've got to capture that tournament-style treeless forest, in other words, that small blob on the top left-hand corner, and my opponent has to do ditto with the one in the bottom right-hand corner. I've got a lot more scoring units than he has, just he's got those chariot blocks and that unit of tomb guard, so I'm still hopeful I can outmaneuver him. Now, with this setup, as you can see, I've gone heavy on one side of the table, which is something I've done with this army a few times in practice, hoping to be able to outmaneuver him. I've still got enough on the left-hand side, I think, to be able to defeat that chariot block. My opponent has very wisely placed his Titan in the centre. I was really hoping he was going to stick it on one flank and then I could go and run everything else to the other flank and try and outmaneuver it. I think this could be a very interesting game. Both of us have got some very vulnerable things in our army lists and also some obvious vulnerabilities in our opponent that we can exploit. For me, I think there are three obvious problems. The first is going to be to dish out enough damage on these big undead units. Of course, these don't rout, and so you've got to crumble them, and I don't really have the static combat resolution with my small knight units to be able to do that. I'm going to have to charge them in waves and eventually wear them down. The second problem is that Titan stamping all over my army. And the third problem is also the Titan, which I decided to put in there just to emphasise how much of a problem it is. Magic-wise, Chantel gets Comet, Ice Shard Blizzard, Uranon's Thunderbolt and Harmonic Convergence. Marie gets Shem's Burning Gaze and the Net of Amitok. Not bad spells at all. Tomb King's turn 1 is very quiet. My opponent has very little ranged threat. In the magic phase, I let him cast all of the buffs on his Tomb Guard unit, which I have no intention whatsoever of fighting, and save my dice to dispel the Casket's bound spell, the Light of Death. Bretonnian turn 1 sees immediate, unmitigated disaster. I've got 4 units of Knights Errant, and these young impatient knights, if they are able to charge, have to take a leadership test to avoid being forced to do so. And lo and behold, 2 of my Knight Errant units fail the 8 rerollable leadership tests and have to declare charges. Now, this normally isn't the end of the world when you've got more conventional knight-errant formations, because generally, with a long lance of knight-errant, they will win combat when they go and have to charge, and you'll usually then be in trouble in subsequent turns. Now with these small blocks, it's much worse because I could easily lose combat and then allow my opponent to either pursue or get a free reform where he can then jump on me in the next turn. Now the reason why it's so bad on this occasion is because the only 2 targets that my 2 failing units can declare charges against are the Titan, aka Automatic Instant Death TM, and the Tomb Guard that have just had 3 buff spells cast on them and are pretty much the same thing. So those overexcitable and extremely virile young knights errant thunder into these 2 certain death combats, and the latter goes and takes repants with them as well. Ugh, dear oh dear oh dear. Now in addition to that, which I could do nothing about, I've also gone and blundered as well. Those Knights of the Realm on the right, I've charged into the chariots. A perfectly reasonable charge under normal circumstances, but now my Knights Errant have gone and done those stupid moves. When they lose combat, those Tomb Guard will be able to reform and smash into their side. I do get some buff spells off in my magic phase, but it's not enough for these 2 units. The Knights Errant smash into the Titan, wounding it just a single time before it flattens them with a mighty roll of 11 on its thunderstomps. In the Tomb Guard combat, I do manage to ping off the Necrotect, but the Elite Guard smash to bits all of my Knights Errant and run down repants into the bargain. They then manage to turn round to face the side of my Knight of the Realm unit, who for their part fight extremely badly and just do a couple of wounds on one of the chariots. On Tomb King's turn 2, I'm really staring down the barrel. Those Tomb Guard thunder into the side of the Knights of the Realm, probably with the intent of destroying them and then overrunning into Pierre. For its part, the Titan declares a charge into the Knights Errant. It's needing a long one, but those Knights fail their terror test on an 8 rerollable and run. The Titan redirects into the Reliquary, and that also fails an 8 rerollable. The odds of failing one of these is only about 10%, but I've failed 4 of the 5 that I've had to take, and all of them have been crucial. I'm in complete disarray as we run into the combat phase, and the Tomb Guard smash apart the Knights of the Realm and overrun into Pierre as predicted. The less said about my right flank the better, so let's have a look at the left. As you can see here, I actually placed Michel my Pegadin in front of this chariot block in my last turn. I know he's probably going to die, but at least when he does, I'll be able to get some great charges on that chariot block with my other knights. they duly accept the invitation and chop him to bits underneath the bony scythed wheels. If all this wasn't enough, the Green Knight didn't show up on Bretonnian turn 1. I probably only got around 1,000 points of stuff left on the table that can still move, and I'm only in my turn 2. On my turn 2, I do get that good charge on that chariot block, with some knights errant losing one of their number going through that forest, and the Grail Knights, who I have particularly high hopes for on the charge, into the side, and then the Grail Reliquary there into the front. My Green Knight does come on this time and stations himself behind these chariots. I'm really going to need his help, I think, if I'm going to chew through this unit. The peasant bowmen march round to the left of the building to try to threaten the Casket of Souls and leave Chantal there on the right on the board edge. After all, Adam doesn't really have any shooting, so I think she's going to be okay. In the magic phase, I get a Comet of Cassandora off near the casket and next to that little archer unit at the back where his level 4 wizard is hiding. The trebuchets once again manage to hit the Casket of Souls. On the first turn they rolled a 1 to wound it. This time we do wound it, but we only roll a 1 on the multiple wounds d6. Things really not going for the Bretonnians at the moment. The only good thing is that the last of my Pegadins, Gaston, who is the most powerful, has managed to get away from the chariot blocks and has stationed himself very near that level 4 wizard and his unit of skeletons. I'm hopeful that they won't be able to avoid my ambushing Pegadin, and at least Gaston can skewer the magic source of the Tomb Kings. In terms of the objective, there's absolutely nothing I'm going to be able to do about that Tomb Guard unit now capturing my objective, so the best I can hope for is to try and win on the left and secure a tie on the objective. Tomb King turn 3 sees Adam move up his Tomb Guard to try to get to the forest and swing his chariot block around. I've got no prospect of challenging the former with my little units or what's left of them, but the latter have copped a little bit of damage from the Knights of the Realm and Sir Pierre before they went down and have lost around a third of their number. For its part, the Titan starts destroying the trebuchets. To be honest, that's okay. I think it could probably be doing even more damage elsewhere. In the combat over on the left, as you can see, my Knight charge did brilliantly last turn. They managed to flatten about 4 of the chariots, just leaving the Tomb Prince and a single charioteer remaining. But then disaster strikes in this combat phase, with the Tomb Prince and his single remaining charioteer fighting like hell for leather, and my own units missing and spooning their attacks completely. Both of my Knight units, the Grails and the Errants, both break from combat, leaving only the Grail Reliquary there to stick. That's another real kick down there for the Bretonnians, with another pair of failed leadership tests. Still, I do have the Green Knight coming in next turn. He doesn't disappoint me, running into the back of the chariots and destroying both the Tomb Prince and the remaining charioteer. Better news still, both the Grail Knights and those Knights Errant managed to rally and turn round, so I hopefully should preserve those points. On the right hand side, Gaston charges those skeleton archers who weren't fast enough to get out of the way, and in the combat phase, assisted by both Harmonic Convergence and an Ice Shard Blizzard, skewers the Hierophant and the level 4 wizard with his lance. In the next Tomb King turn, the Casket of Souls fails its crumble test and explodes, giving me a few more points. I'm also lucky that the comet doesn't arrive and hit Gaston, and perhaps even more fortunate that he leaves just a few skeletons left alive for him to kill in the next Tomb King turn, and then him to get to turn round to do mischief elsewhere. Where I get a lot less lucky though is Chantal, who's lingering on the board edge. The Tomb Guard are 17 inches away from her, and my opponent declares a charge on her, telling me that he's got both the Banner of Swiftness giving them +1 movement and some kind of a golden mask on his Tomb King that causes terror. You guessed it, Chantal immediately fails her Leadership 8 test and runs off the board. That's frustrating because unless the Titan came after her, which would have meant abandoning its attempts to try and deprive me of the objective, Chantal was almost certainly going to get out alive, but now she's been terror-bombed off the board. The rest of the game I'll just summarise. I manage with my one remaining trebuchet to hit the Tomb Prince in the other chariot unit, who doesn't have enough models to get a look out, sir, and I flatten him. Then Gaston, despite having a debuff cast on him by the Titan, charges down the hill into the back of that second chariot squadron who have just lost the Prince, and reduces them to a pile of bones. On the right hand side of the board, it's a question of whether that Titan can get far enough onto that table side to destroy my Grail Reliquary, which is hiding in the forest and drawing me the objective. In the end, it's not able to do so. It destroys the trebuchet and manages to laser off the Grail Knight unit with one of its spells. And with that, a brutal first game is all over, and we calculate the scores and I lose by 11 points to 9. To be honest, given the absolutely disastrous turn 1, where my knights errant just charged into the lion's mouth and then were destroyed for their pains alongside with almost my entire right flank, I think I did rather well to get out of this with only a skinny loss. I definitely made some bad mistakes in this game, however. I couldn't help those knights errant charging in, but I shouldn't have charged my Knights of the Realm into that chariot unit or left Sir Pierre on the right of it, because I could have easily told that probably the Tomb Guard were going to destroy my errant unit and then be able to sandwich both of them. I don't think my approach against the Titan was wrong in principle. It was that clutch of failed Leadership 8 rerollable tests, which meant that an army where I should have been outmaneuvering him ended up being outmaneuvered by a bunch of shambling skeletons. The Green Knight and Sir Gaston did rather bail me out though, and they scored a lot of points between them because they managed to get behind my opponent and inflict some damage on him, something that Tomb Kings are always vulnerable to. I do think my opponent played quite well though. He certainly out-deployed me and managed to get me to bunch all my knights up on one side of the battlefield, which ended up maximising the damage that Titan was able to inflict. So obviously disappointing to lose my first game, but quite frankly, I thought I was going to be absolutely pasted in that battle at the end of turn 1, so happy to come out with 9 points. Now of course these tournaments use Swiss pairing, and so I'll be matched against another player who has got a similar or ideally the same result to me in the first round, so I'm hoping for an easier game. However, when the draw comes up, it's obvious I'm not going to get one, because my opponent is Mike Sylvester, who actually won one of the previous Cardiff Crusade tournaments, and I played twice at the last 2 events. Now of course I would expect to find an opponent like Mike on some of the higher tables, so obviously he's had a bit of a disaster in his first game. I have to admit, I've been indulging in a bit of trash talk with this man prior to the event, with him taking the mick out of my reliquaries trying to claim they were overpowered, and me knocking the stuffing out of a certain thing in his army, which is this outrageous affront to wargaming and indeed humanity that you can see here, a single 11-point cold one. Now the reason why this is so outrageous is that Bretonnians used to be allowed to have single unicorns, a rather modest clutch for a rubbish army. And now the Dark Elves, one of the most powerful armies in the game, are allowed something roughly equivalent in the shape of this single cold one. So, this is illegal, and this isn't. Anyway, this is Captain Cold One's Dark Elf army, and you can see that the whole thing is fast cavalry. Now, what Mike is trying to do here is something quite similar to what I'm trying to do. He's trying to use mobility in an objective-based tournament to be able to score and to pick off target and ignore the big infantry blocks. Now of course, in some ways, his army is even more extreme than mine, because it's faster and these are fast cavalry, which means any number of free reforms. My stuff's not, it's heavy cavalry, and so while fast is a lot more limited in its movement. So there's no way that my army will be able to outmaneuver Mike's army. The only advantage I do have is I have a lot more units than he does, and so if I use my charge arcs intelligently, I might make it difficult for him to move anywhere without getting a night charge. I also have quite a few magic missiles in the list, as well as that Ruby Ring of Ruin and the Worm Lance, as well as my 2 trebuchets. So even though most of the Dark Elf army can shoot or cast magic missiles, I've certainly got some guns to fire back at him. So the core of his army is made up of 3 large blocks of Dark Riders with repeating crossbows, and then he's got 2 units of Doomfire Warlocks. One of them, the Warlock Star, there on the left, a really large formation, and then a smaller unit of 6 of them. That large Warlock Star also contains 2 Masters, one of whom is the BSB and a level 1 Wizard. There's also a level 4 wizard running Death in this list, which is a very dangerous lore and excellent at sniping characters, of which I have many. He then has a Dreadlord on a Dark Pegasus, no doubt with the Cloak of Twilight and a 1-up rerollable armor save, and then a single assassin there on his own who is actually riding the Arabian Carpet, which enables him to fly. Now, I've faced this list once before during practice, and I think it's quite an even matchup. The Dark Elves will initially be able to outmaneuver me, but if Mike bites off more than he can chew, or one of my units gets a little bit lucky, we might be able to hold him up and then countercharge him with some other things. And if I am able to countercharge any of these fast cavalry blocks, even with relatively modest units, I ought to win combat and win them handsomely. Now, this scenario is called Dawn Attack, and the mission is to invade the opposition deployment zone, something that both of our fast armies are excellent at. Also, the deployment is a little bit funny, with us being only allowed to deploy in 3/4 of the board facing each other, with a large blank space on either side. We're also allowed to hold 2 units back as ambushers. Mike elects not to do this, given that he's got so much speed in his army anyway, but I elect to hold back both Grail Reliquaries, which are going to try and march onto the board into his deployment zone and try and claim that. So you can see my deployment here. That piece of terrain in the bottom right hand corner is an impassable one, and I've tried to cluster around it, having my knights facing all sorts of directions to stop me being outmaneuvered. Mike's battle line, meanwhile, gloriously symmetrical in stark contrast to the higgledy-piggledy mess over in my deployment zone. Now, as can so often be the case, while I think my deployment was excellent in principle, there are minor imperfections in its execution, which Mike ruthlessly exploits. So you can see both of these excellent pieces of aggression from the Dark Elves in turn 1. The assassin flies up to the corner of that building so that there's nothing that can charge him, but he can charge quite a lot of things. And the Dark Riders run up just in front of Chantel's Peasant Bowman bunker. The problem with this is Chantel's non-fighting Peasant Bowman block is going to stop me connecting anything into the Doomfire's front arc. Now, the Knight Errant unit on its left-hand side would be able to swing into its flank, but generally I think the philosophy of this fast cavalry list is that you can allow yourself to be seen by a single target and hope to destroy it or compromise it in the shooting and magic phase to stop it being able to do so. Now, Mike has a lot of shooting with his 2 repeater bolt throwers and all of these repeating crossbows, which of course are armor piercing against Bretonnians, and he has not a bad opening turn. He reduces the Knight of the Realm unit to 3 models and also destroys half of the Knight Errant unit which could have charged his Dark Riders. The Dark Elf Wizard has all 3 of the Law of Death snipe spells and Doom and Darkness, but only manages to get off the latter. This is placed on that Knight Errant unit that's compromised in the shooting phase, but despite that, they're still able to pass their panic test. Now in my turn 1, I've got to respond to Mike's Blitzkrieg. I do so initially by congering my skirmishers in front of the Doomfire Warlocks and moving Chantel to the back. The point of this is to stop the Doomfires being able to charge in and giving Chantel enough cover that she should be reasonably safe. It's not ideal, but risks have to be taken in a game as cutthroat as this. With that philosophy in mind, I also throw the 2 weakened knight units forwards boldly to try to use them as chaff, pushing up behind with my other units that are still at full strength. On the right hand side, I am able to be much more aggressive with my 3 Pegadins, and I think they are where my principal chance in this game really comes in. Also, very obligingly, the Green Knight comes on in the first turn and plonks himself behind the main Warlock star. For magic, and I should say that Chantel drew Harmonic Convergence, Ice Shard Blizzard, Curse of the Midnight Wind and Uranon's Thunderbolt, and Marie Shem's Burning Gaze and Banishment, I'm not really able to get any useful spells off, but in the shooting phase I start to get quite lucky. The first thing is Michel with his Worm Lance. I placed him in front of one of those Dark Rider units and dared them to charge him, but he lets off a stream of fire from the tip of his lance and 5 of the Dark Riders are consumed. Needless to say, that was an excellent roll from a strength 3 breath weapon considering the Riders are saving on 4 up. Even better for me is those Dark Riders fail their panic test and skirt towards the board edge. In Mike's next turn, they actually fail to rally, meaning I've taken off one of those blocks just with a little 20-point lance. Then, to cap it off, one of my trebuchets lands a rock on top of one of the other Dark Rider units and flattens 5 of them. These, however, do pass their panic test. Now moving on to Dark Elves turn 2, and I have almost made an unwitting cock-up. And that's that skirmish screen that was in front of those Doomfire Warlocks protecting Chantal is actually a lot more vulnerable than I thought it was. There are two reasons for that. The first is that a skirmishing formation, when it is charged, actually bunches together towards its centre, which would mean that that gap between Chantal and the Doomfires is going to get about the same size as they are, and so they might be able to fit through it. The second was that I shot those Doomfires with my Peasant Bowmen in the shooting phase, and was pleased enough to kill one of them, but that's also slimmed down the width of the formation, potentially giving them enough space to fit through the gap. After we measure it up by around 1/4 of an inch, Chantal is safe, which is very fortunate for me, for that was almost a disastrous blunder. Now Mike makes plenty of charges, and his first one is to use that Dreadlord to maximum effect. I double flee with my 2 Knight-Errant units in blue, leaving the Dreadlord to stumble forwards, but at the risk of really compromising my offensive battle line. Then the assassin flies out like Aladdin over the building into the Peasant Bowman's skirmishers, who are going to have a hard time against him. However, that assassin is as naked as the day he was born, so if my drunken bowman can somehow just get a few blades through the steel defence, I'll be able to drop him fairly easily. Mike's magic and shooting phase are again not very effective. I managed to stop the 2 death snipes that are coming at my paladin through the use of Marie's Dispel magic scroll, and his shooting, while it does do 2 wounds on my green Wormlights wielding paladin Michel, doesn't bring him down, and he's going to have an excellent charge on the Dark Elf unit containing the wizard in the next turn. It's going to be very dicey, of course, because he does just have 1 wound left. In the combat phase, the assassin slashes a large number of peasant bowmen to ribbons, and the remaining rabble can't land a blow on him. Because this is a skirmishing unit, there's no steadfast, and they run off the board, with the assassin overrunning into the Knight-Errant unit containing Marie behind. On the left-hand side, the Doomfires, who charge the Knights of the Realm, which I placed in front of them, wipe them out and overrun forwards for fear of the Green Knight coming up behind. Right, into Bretonnian turn 2, and I think this could be the one where I win this game. So, by overrunning as they did, the Dark Riders have exposed their flank to 2 Knight units. One of the Errants and one of the 3-man unit of Grail Knights, who both charge in and connect. I think with a buff spell or 2, we should be able to say goodnight to this unit, and if we can catch them, that's much of Mike's army that will be able to run down. The other great charge I get is Sir Michel, who flies into the bunker with the level 4 wizard, and their stand and shoot reaction doesn't bring the Great Knight down. Hopefully, if he can just hold in combat, I'm going to be able to skewer that level 4. In the magic phase, Mike expends his resources stopping harmonic convergence on those units thundering into his side, but I am able to get Ice Shard Blizzard off. That should help minimise the number of casualties I take, but more importantly reduce Mike's leadership by 1, for when, or hopefully when, he loses that combat. I should also say that one of the Grail Reliquaries turns up, and the second one comes on in my next turn, and they both start a long march towards Mike's deployment zone, but he doesn't have much in the way of resources to do much about them, so I'm hopeful they can capture the objective. So on to the combat phase, where I'm feeling very optimistic. The Dark Riders aren't able to get a blade through Michel, and he skewers the level 4 wizard with his Worm Lance. Then the unit fails its break test and disappears off the board. That's 2 units and the level 4 wizard that paladin has done for. That's magnificent. Michel tries to follow them off the table, but rolls a 111 and pulls up short of the table edge, perhaps ready to get repeater bolt throwered in the next turn. Now, moving on to the big combat, and the lady has most certainly been with me so far, but this time she turns against me. I'm able to inflict only 1 wound on one of the masters that makes way with both of these knight units in the side. Despite bringing the best part of 15 or 16 excellent quality attacks to the party, I'm only able to drop 2 of the Doomfires, and they're 1 off losing their steadfast. Had I just been able to kill 1 more, which I think by all rights I really should have done, they would have been testing on a 4 with a re-roll, and I think that probably would have been curtains if Mike had failed that. As it is, the Doomfires are also able, with their Steadfast, to reform and face those 2 units. They're not out of the woods yet though, of course, because that Green Knight is bearing up behind them, and if they aren't able to destroy those 2 Knight units, then the Green Knight will have another chance to connect with them in the next Bretonnian turn, and if he gets in, there's no magic weapons in there, and surely that unit's going to be toast. Now in Dark Elf's turn 3, there's no hiding from that Dreadlord now, and he charges into the back of Repants. Now, I was hoping that I had covered this with my Paladin Gaston, but as you can see, the charge arcs are quite marginal. There was something of a discussion of whether the Dreadlord could actually reform or maybe overrun to try and get out of Gaston's charge arc. In the end, I decided to just be sporting and give this to my opponent. First of all, Mike had been quite nice about that skirmish screen, which was really only a fraction of an inch for whether he would be able to charge his Dark Riders in, and so I think I kind of owed him one there. And secondly, I think I'd involuntarily moved that impassable terrain piece a couple of times in the game with my sleeve when I was moving around the troops, and so I could hardly vouch for its position. Fine margin, of course, but sometimes this can be a finely balanced game, especially when you've got 2 armies that are all about movement, going at each other's throats. In the shooting phase, Mike's repeater bolt throwers fail to kill the Pegadins, which hopefully should spell an end for them soon. In the combat phase, there's nothing Repents can do, and the Dreadlord skewers her with his lance. However, the assassin has an equestrian disaster, and the horses manage to hit him 3 times on 5s and smash him to a pulp. This is pretty big because it's now freed up that Knight Errant unit to be able to charge the Dreadlord. The Warlock Star smashes apart the remaining Knight units, but Mike has also done something rather clever in his movement phase, which is taken out his level 1 wizard in that compromised Dark Rider unit on the left and stuck her in front of the Green Knight, which is going to stop me bringing my foot down on the windpipe of this Dark Elf army. In the combat phase, we managed to get an Ice Shard Blizzard off on the Dreadlord, and Marie's unit of Knights Errant has an excellent chance of destroying him, hitting him in the flank. While we don't manage to damage him thanks to his 1-up rerollable armor save, we win combat by 3, and he tests on a 6 with Ice Shard Blizzard with no reroll, and the bugger goes and passes it and turns round to boot. In Dark Elf turn 4, I realise I've made the biggest mistake I've made so far in the game, which is that those Doomfire Warlocks who were in front of the skirmish screen, who ran off, I neglected to say, have managed to rally and come down behind the Trebuchet. They charge it in the back, which I realise too late will enable them to run into the side of Chantal, which will mean she's going to die. His Warlock Star runs up the table to his deployment zone to try and chase off the slowly advancing Grail Reliquaries in what remains of the game. In the combat phase, the Dreadlord does do some damage against the Knights Errant, but he still loses combat by 2. He tests on a 7 with no reroll, and you guessed it, he passes it again. In Bretonnian turn 4, Gaston charges the rear of the Dreadlord, and he's going to let him have it with his super nasty attack, and surely this Dark Elf Lord won't be lucky for a 3rd time. In the magic phase, Chantal manages to get a harmonic convergence in addition to the Ice Shard Blizzard on the Dreadlord, surely turning something which is already very heavily stacked in my favour to a borderline certainty. In the combat phase, the Green Knight dispatches the level 1 wizard who is so impertinently stuck herself in front of him, and then we come with beating drums to the Battle Royale, which will surely be the defeat of this infernal Dreadlord. Gaston pops his Tress of Isolde, needing 2s to hit, rerolling 1s with Harmonic Convergence, and 2 to wound, rerolling 1s with Harmonic Convergence, and scores the full complement of 8 wounds. Mike picks up the dice with the modest avowal of, "I think I'm going to survive this," and nonchalantly rolls them across the table. The first roll he passes 6 of his 8 armor saves, and the second roll he passes both of the others, meaning the Dreadlord just pinged off every single attack that was thrown at him, 8 wounds and no damage. Given this round's getting near the bell, a few onlookers have come to gather, and they witness my roar of disgust as the Dreadlord shrugs off all this damage. They also witness an even louder roar of disgust when the Dreadlord, having lost combat, this time by 4, once again sticks with a 6 with no reroll. The significance of the Dreadlord shrugging off this damage is really quite immense, because those Doomfires that have come round the back of the Trebuchet and have now killed Chantel as well are able to thunder into the back of that Knight-Errant unit, and are supported by the remaining Dark Riders that used to have the level 1 wizard in them. Needless to say, these Knights-Errant are slaughtered along with Marie. Had that Dreadlord broken, they'd have pursued him up the table and wouldn't have suffered this fate. In the remainder of this game, the Warlock Star go into one of my Reliquaries, which refuses to budge, holding on an 8. And at that point, the round was called. I didn't end up getting my turn 6, and it would have been possible that I could have won the game in it, because I could have marched up my second Grail Reliquary into Mike's deployment zone. I also could have charged the back of the Warlock Star with the Green Knight. That being said, the Warlock Star might easily have been able to kill one of the Reliquaries and potentially panic the other, and could have limited the damage that the Green Knight did by challenging him out with the unit champion or the master. So I think it could have really gone either way in the last turn, and so the fact that it didn't happen, I'm not sure necessarily had a huge effect, because it could have gone either way. Anyway, with a tied objective, this very brutal and dramatic game ended up in yet another loss for the Bretonnians, this time by a margin of 12 points to 8. I have to say, I was a bit cheesed off with that as a result. It was a fabulous game of Warhammer and I really enjoyed it, but I think I really should have won that game. Given what I'd managed to do early, admittedly with quite a lot of luck, I had some really big moments that went against me later on. The first, I think, was the failure of those 2 Knight units to break those Doomfires when they got them in the flank. I think that was probably a 70-30 in my favour, and had I got that, I would have scored a huge number of points. The second, which was most certainly significantly more than 70-30 in my favour, was that Dreadlord, who really got away there with murder, and managed, by his resilient sticking, to net the Dark Elves another block of victory points at the end. Needless to say, this was one of those games that helps perpetuate certain stereotypes about wargamers, because I got through about 2 bottles of water in sweat by the end of it, and it was an excellent battle against a man who I'm coming to regard as something of a rival. Needless to say, that cold one just spent the entire battle grazing behind a hill and eating grass, and I didn't get to kill him, which was very disappointing. So that leaves me with the derisory score of 17 points out of a possible 40 from my 2 games, so I'm firmly bunted down to one of the lower tables. I'm hoping for an easy matchup to round off my day, and I absolutely don't get one. It's a dwarf army led by Andrew Green, who is an opponent I've not faced before. It's obvious I'm going to be struggling the moment my opponent puts his dwarf army on the table, because it's centred around 2 colossal Death Stars. One of them is an enormous unit of Longbeards, around 40 or 45 strong, and the second is an unbreakable horde of Troll Slayers led by Ungrim Ironfist. The biggest unit I have is 6 Knights, and so there's absolutely nothing I'm going to be able to do to challenge these dwarves seriously in combat. Now normally against dwarves, especially a very infantry Death Star focused dwarf list like this, the objectives would be a piece of cake for my fast army, but you guessed it, I've gone and got the Hold the Centre objective, which is there sitting like a turkey dinner on a conveyor belt buffet right in front of the 2 Death Star units to waddle up to at their leisure, knowing full well there's nothing I can do about them. And all the elaborate dressage in the world isn't going to alter the fundamental physics of that situation. This objective also scores points each turn from the end of turn 2 onwards. It's really a question of whether I can actually outnumber him on that objective, and that's going to be problematic because I'm going to be staring into the face of 80 dwarves. So what I hope to do here is use my Reliquaries to do the bulk of my scoring. Hopefully I can use the cover from that building for the one on the left, and even if they do get engaged in combat, with their tiny frontage, I don't think they're going to drop quickly. The Longbeards are actually only armed with hand weapons and shields, which is rather less frightening to me than if they had great weapons. So while it's certainly true that I've got no chance here on the War of Attrition, I do think the Reliquaries do give me something to fight back with in that sense. Now on the flanks of the battlefield, I think I have an excellent chance of sweeping the board. Andrew's got a couple of units of crossbowmen, a cannon, an organ gun and a gyrocopter. I think that I really should be able to get in contact with them very quickly and be able to slaughter them. The cannon isn't going to be a problem, because really the things that are vulnerable to it, the trebuchets and the pegadins, I'm able to bunch up behind that building because I drop them after the cannon, because I've got so many more drops than Andrew has. As far as the blocks are concerned, I think if I fire both trebuchets at one of the blocks, try and use magic on it, perhaps try and use Michelle's worm lance along the side, I might be able to whittle it down. I fancy the Slayers rather more than I do the Longbeards because they've got no armour save. Now the fundamental contours of this battle actually get even clearer and more amplified when my opponent rolls for his ancestral grudge, and of course he rolls the one where his whole army hates my army. But to be honest, those blocks were already unfightable, this just makes it doubly so. The first turn of the game for both armies is an extremely sedate affair, with the dwarves simply waddling forward and their shooting failing to damage the Bretonnians, with the cannon messing up. All I lose is a couple of knights errant from the two blocks on the side to the crossbowmen. Now my turn is all about movement, and I push my knight units forwards. Now infantry blocks are harder to zone in 8th edition than they used to be in previous ones, but you can certainly still do it to dwarves because they can only charge up to 15 inches, and for my knights 16 inches is a very gettable charge, so I'm able just to kind of hang back with most of my army knowing they can't be charged. If the infantry blocks want to charge my reliquary, then they're welcome to do so, I'll simply flee. I decide to still be a bit more cautious with my Pegasi, leaving them behind the building, but with Michelle able to see the crossbowmen but not able to see the cannon. Now my plan here is to try and charge the Grail Knights and Michelle into that crossbow unit, and position Michelle on the side in such a way that he can overrun into that cannon when the crossbow unit breaks. Not entirely without risk, but an interesting ploy I think. The magic phase is uneventful, but in the shooting phase I managed to get a glancing treb hit on the Slayers, taking off around 8 of them. In Andrew's turn 2 there's again not very much to see. The organ gun unloads into one of the knight units and managed to kill about half of them, the cannon once again stuffs up, and the crossbow units again do some very small damage. Now it's Bretonnian turn 2 where this battle gets out of first gear, and I perform a lot of charges and manage to get them all off. So to start with, we've got the Grail Knights, one of the depleted units of Knight Errant, and also one of the Pegasus riding Paladins, all into that crossbow dwarf block at the top. Once I see them off, as by all rights I should do, I'll be able to overrun into that cannon behind with the Pegadin. On the top right, I also get 2 Knight units, both Knight Errant units, along with Marie, into the other unit of crossbow dwarves. As far as the organ gun is concerned, Repance's Knight Errant unit thunders into that. That should be all of Andrew's shooting destroyed, and I can just concentrate on trying to whittle down these blocks. Now, the Green Knight turns up this turn, so I run him in front of the Troll Slayer unit. I expect him to be charged and I expect him to collapse, but that's absolutely fine because he's got loads of time to come back to life. But in the meantime, I'm going to be able to run forwards with the 2 reliquaries and also a Knight of the Realm unit to pile 3 units within 6 of the objective and thus capture it. I really don't mind it if Andrew charges the Knight of the Realm unit, I just intend to flee with them. Meanwhile, I turn Gaston round to look at the trebuchets, because that gyrocopter has popped behind my lines and I would really like to hold on to those 2 war machines. Right, onto the magic phase, and Chantel's spells, which I should have given at the front, were Comet of Cassandora, Uranon's Thunderbolt, Harmonic Convergence and Ice Shard Blizzard. Marie got Briona's Time Warp and the Light of Battle. The second is a spell I'd rarely take, but I think it might be quite good here to try and perhaps make one of those reliquaries unbreakable if it's up against a stiff fight. The magic phase sees me get Comet of Cassandora off with a miscast. The Comet I place smack bang on the head of these 2 dwarf units, hoping to whittle them down further. However, the miscast is a bad one, and Chantel loses 3 wizard levels. All she's got left now is Uranon's Thunderbolt, so it's going to be up to Marie to provide most of the magic support from here on in. However, the shooting phase is outstanding. Using the Worm Lance and using the Trebs, I managed to destroy another 14 or so Slayers, leaving them with just around 20 guys left. Andrew actually has a magic item which gives these blocks a 5-up ward against shooting, but he literally doesn't manage to make a single one and his dwarves keep dropping. The combat on the left falls heavily in my favour, and the Pegadin manages to overrun into the cannon. I don't kill all the dwarves, but the remainder roll a double 6 on their flee and flee off the board with both knight units in hot pursuit. On the right hand side, the other unit of crossbows proves extremely resilient, and both knight-errant units completely spoon their attacks, leaving around 4 dwarves left. We do break them, but the dwarves manage to outdistance the pursuing white knight-errant unit. Marie's unit, in the meantime, turns round to try and close back in the centre where her magical backup will sorely be needed. Repance's knight-errant unit fighting the organ gun rather stuffs it up, and while it might be delaying the inevitable, the one dwarf they leave alive passes his stubborn break test and defends his war machine till the last. That was an excellent turn, and the Bretonnians claim the objective by 3-2. In the next dwarf turn, Andrew just has 2 dwarf blocks left to move, and so his turn is literally taking about 30 seconds. He elects to charge the Green Knight with his Slayers, and Ungrim Ironfist takes on the champion of Bretonnia in a challenge. The Green Knight actually rolls really well and wounds Ungrim 3 times, but the Dwarf King passes all 3 of his ward saves. He strikes back and wounds the Green Knight a couple of times, and then the champion of Bretonnia collapses under combat resolution. Andrew's Longbeard unit, meanwhile, elects to charge one of the Reliquaries, and slams into it and wins combat handsomely. The Reliquary tests on a stubborn 8 and fails. That's probably the first bit of fortune Andrew's had. However, because the Longbeards are facing onto the building, there's not really anything he can do with overruns, so he just elects to reform and take what comes to him in the next Bretonnian turn. Now in this turn I once again elect to hold back, hoping that the Comet is going to do more damage to the Slayers. This also gives my knight units on the flanks of the battlefield a chance to sweep round back into the centre. At this stage of the game I'm really quite far ahead, and so it should really just be a question in risk mitigation for me. I think I've done a lot of damage on that Slayer unit, and I really should just be able to destroy them with a couple more magic spells and then maybe a final charge. Then I'll try and keep that Longbeard unit occupied with my Reliquaries and try and claim the objective. All sounds rather simple really, doesn't it? Right, then it's on to the magic phase, and the Comet turns up and smashes around another 5 Slayers and 5 Longbeards off the board. Chantal tries to zap the Slayers with her only remaining spell, the Thunderbolt, and she goes and double 6s it. While the Thunderbolt fries another 5 Slayers, Chantal rolls her customary signature dimensional cascade, and down the hole she goes. The detonation destroys 5 of the peasant bowmen as well, and they also panic and run. Very little happens in the next dwarf turn, but in the next Bretonnian turn sees plenty of action. Given that Slayer unit is now diminished and thus inherently less vulnerable to the trebuchets, and given Chantal's gone down the hole, I think the best way of finishing off these Slayers is going to be in combat with my very plentiful spare resources. So I crash 3 knight units into it on 3 sides and a Pegadin to boot. Now, I had no real plans of engaging that Longbeard unit, but because it's reformed the way it has, I decide to charge it with the other Reliquary, the Pegasus Knight, and 3 Grail Knights in both sides. That's going to mean the thing can't reform and is going to only be throwing a few attacks against my knights. I think I've really got the Longbeards exactly where I want them here. Hopefully I'll be able to win these combats and stop the Longbeards being able to reform and thus tick over those objective counters. I've also got Gaston coming in from the back as well in case I need some more combat resolution, and another unit of Knights Errant coming up there that you can see on the left. Now in the combat phase my knights do plenty of damage on the Slayers, although with their death blows they take quite a lot of knights down in reply, and I only end up winning combat by about 3, leaving around 5 Slayers plus Ungrim left for the grind out. Now the combat with the Longbeards ends up being a bit of a disaster. For literally the 3rd time in 3 games the Grail Knights have got a plum flank charge, and once again they really spoon it. Despite the dwarves only having a very small number of attacks on the side, they managed to do enough damage to actually win combat, and both the Pegasus riding Paladin and the Grail Knights break and flee, with only the Reliquary stubbornly holding up the Longbeards. That was really a very warped combat. I think I could fight that many times and not lose it. Now of course, it's absolutely imperative that I keep that Longbeard unit pinned, because those Slayers aren't going to be going anywhere for a little while, and Ungrim is more or less invincible, so I'm going to be fighting that unit for the whole of the rest of the game, and I cannot afford the Longbeards to sweep in there and win combat against my knights. The grind out continues in subsequent turns, but both my Pegadin and the single remaining Grail Knight do rally. Now once again, I've got 2 Grail Reliquaries in the side of that Longbeard unit, once again preventing it from reforming. But I'm really not 100% confident they can survive. Both of them have lost all of their battle pilgrims and are quite significantly damaged. Thus I decide to let them have it with a rear charge with the Knights Errant, thus hopefully assuring me of a victory in that combat and thus claiming the objective once again. I also decide to charge Gaston into Ungrim, so I can use his Tress of Isolde and his Virtue of Knightly Temper to hopefully impale the Slayer King. In the combat phase, we once again fight astonishingly badly. Against the Longbeards, one of the Reliquaries is destroyed, and despite the Knights Errant being in their rear, the doughty fighters hack all 3 of them down. There's 1 remaining Reliquary now with just a couple of wounds left, and fortunately that manages to stick. For his part, Gaston once again epically spoons his big charge, with me rolling 3 1s on 4 dice with my to hit rolls that hit on 2+, and then failing to wound Ungrim. The Bretonnians really seem intent on snatching defeat from the jaws of victory in a game where they've been in utter and complete control. Marie is trying to use her light of battle on some of my units to keep them from fleeing. But at this point, Andrew is actually being able to use his runes of spellbreaking, which he hasn't been able to so far because of all my double sixing, and thus Marie's impact is limited. The final turn sees the remaining Grail Reliquary fail a crucial stubborn 8 rerollable leadership test and flee, thus allowing the Longbeards to sit on top of the objective and score. Thus the dwarves manage like a submarine to be able to surface right on turns 5 and 6 and claim 2 points on the objective, thus equaling me in total. Ungrim also manages to dispatch Gaston in the challenge, netting the dwarves some more points. In the final Bretonnian turn, the Green Knight, who has spent 3 turns coming back to life, charges the Longbeard unit and manages to assassinate the Dwarven BSB, giving me a bit of a bump at the end. On the fringes of the battlefield, the vaguely comedic combat between those 4 remaining dwarf crossbowmen and those 5 white knights errant continues. We literally fought this for I think around 8 rounds, and each and every time both sides couldn't damage each other. Given that this was rather stacked in my favour though, this was also a bit crap from the knights errant. Right, so the battle was over and it finished up as a 10-10 draw. From a competitive standpoint, I was pretty disappointed with this. I'd been in complete control of the game, and the dwarves managed somehow to snatch the objective off me at the end. They also managed to break those Reliquary units, managed to break the Grail Knights and the Pegadin in the side, and then hack apart all of my Fortitude Bearing unit despite it being in the rear. It's often sometimes said that you can fight a battle again and get a completely different result, but in this case I'm not really sure that would be true. I actually think we might have got a quite similar result. Perhaps I was lucky to kill the Slayers, perhaps Andrew was lucky with his Longbeards to be able to win those combats when he was flank and rear charged against stubborn Reliquaries. But fundamentally this was a chalk and cheese matchup, and I think the Bretonnians were always going to dominate the early game, win on the flanks, and then the dwarves were going to be really hard to shift off the centre. Now I do sometimes find talking to dwarf players quite interesting, because their army can do some things excellently and can't do other things at all, and so sometimes I think there's probably a greater element of predictability when you go into certain games. And I think that can make them easier to understand for people who actually didn't see the game unfold. It was thus quite interesting to chat to Andrew about how his other games had gone later in the tournament. So that was the end of day 1, with 2 skinny losses and a draw from my 3 games, or 27 points out of a possible 60. Needless to say, that's absolutely garbage. I don't think I've ever done worse on day 1 of a tournament, even when I started playing the game. I was rather scratching my head about this, and it's definitely true that some of the crucial moments in all 3 games seemed to go against me. But more so than that, I felt that the armies I faced just seemed inherently quite hard for me to deal with, and I do think that in my first and third games a more conventional long lance style Bretonnian list would have been a much better matchup. But anyway, it's interesting to try some different things, and let's hope for a little bit more luck on day 2. Right, after the thrills and mainly spills of Cardiff city centre on a Saturday night, I managed to get some sleep and return to the venue for day 2 to try and salvage some pride. So, game 4 is Dark Elves again, against a player called Archie. A very nice man, but a very nasty army. It's a -5 list, and remember that I'm +4 even with this very stingy comp, and so there's a very big power level difference between these two armies. This Dark Elf list is close to what might be described as a net list, which is to say it's one that's very generically strong and has been fielded on wargame tables all over the place for many years. Now I should say there's nothing wrong with net lists. They're a really good way for new players to learn the game, and I used a Warriors of Chaos net list when I was just starting out. This army is led by the Dark Princess of Perversion and Teenage Fantasies herself, Morathi, who is a level 4 on the Law of Death. Morathi is an excellent spellcaster, getting +D3 to cast each one of her spells and also has good combat potential. The core of the army is the Witch Star, which is of course one of the generically really strong units in 8th edition, a huge unit of witch elves pushing the Cauldron of Blood, no doubt with the Razor Banner to give my knights a harder time. On their right hand side you've got a reasonably large unit of Executioners, also very dangerous against Bretonnians because they've got Killing Blow. Then a couple of Repeater Bolt Throwers, some Shades with a level 1 Wizard in, and a couple of units of Dark Riders. The things in the list that aren't so net listy are a single Bloodrack Medusa, which I assume Archie is going to use as chaff, and a Great Fire Dragon from the Storm of Magic supplement. This is a big dragon with 7s across the board. Now normally Bretonnians are pretty good against single monsters because their long lances are able to bring them down, but for my little lances I think that dragon's going to be much more problematic. So once again I think this is a very difficult matchup for my list. There are parts of the Dark Elf army that can outmaneuver me quite easily because they can fly or are fast cavalry, and the two central units, unless I damage them first, are pretty much unchargeable for my small knight wedges. The mission in this is capture the flags, which means that we each have to nominate 3 of our opponent's scoring units and try and eliminate them. Now Archie only has 3 scoring units, which are the Witch Star, the Executioners and the Crossbowmen. From me, Archie has some choice, and he nominates both Grail Reliquaries and one of my units of Knight Errant. Chantel rolls up Ice Shard Blizzard, Uranon's Thunderbolt, Chain Lightning and Comet of Cassandora, no Harmonic this time. Marie however gets Shem's Burning Gaze and the excellent Net of Amitok. For her part, Morathi gets a couple of the Death Snipes, Soul Blight and the Purple Sun. So here's the battlefield setup, and you can see that I've gone very heavy on one side of the table, leaving the centre of the battlefield for the Witch Star and the Executioners to reign over. Now, fighting an army like this is like dancing on a razor blade. If you make one mistake, you're probably gone. My only advantage is that I know more or less exactly what this army does, because I've faced many things similar to it before. I also think the objective gives me a slight advantage. I think I can destroy that small unit of Dark Shards with some of my Pegadins and the Green Knight. My 2 Reliquaries, as you can see, I've deployed very defensively, so hopefully they'll just sit on my board edge and survive the battle. My scoring Knight Errant unit is there on the left hand side of the table. I'm going to try and use that to run up, maybe kill his Bloodrack Medusa Shrine and maybe a Repeat Bolt Thrower later in the game and keep it out of the main firing line. That's my plan, to try to win the objective by 1 point to 0. Now, Dark Elf turn 1 is a relatively quiet affair. Archie advances with his dragon, but does hang back with it because I think he might be a little bit worried that one of my paladins has heroic Killing Blow. Morathi jumps forward to the side of the hill, but in the magic phase rolls a 2 or a 3 and isn't able to cast a spell that I can't stop, and the shooting pings off a knight or 2 but no real damage done. Now, Bretonnian turn 1 I neglected to take a picture, but I ran up my knights on the left hand side, placing the Knight Errant unit in front of that Bloodrack Medusa, daring it to charge. I also moved up Gaston, stuck him in front of one of the Dark Rider units, daring them to charge him. Michel and Pierre and my Red Knight of the Realm unit also push up, intent on that Sorceress bunker and the scoring Dark Shard unit behind Archie's lines. The magic phase is a weak one, and I'm able only to get Ice Shard Blizzard off on one of the Bolt Throwers. But in the shooting phase, my trebuchets continue their vastly improved performance and both of them land rocks on Morathi's head. However, the lady isn't with me. I roll a 1 to wound on one of them, and the second one, Morathi passes her ward save. Ah, that was a big chance there. The rest of my army generally hangs back, with my knights errant passing their impetuous tests. With that witch star, my plan, which is the standard way of dealing with this unit, is to plonk a knight unit right in front of it and get it to charge it and then overrun with its flank sticking out, which is of course the problem with frenzied units. Then there might be some possibilities. In Dark Elf turn 2, Archie continues to close on my knights in the corner with the witch star. His Dark Riders accept the invitation and thunder down the hill into Sir Gaston, and the Medusa does likewise, charging the 6-man scoring unit of Knights Errant. In the magic phase, Morathi casts Doom and Darkness and Sir Gaston, which I think is a very good move, because if he now loses combat only by 1, the Dark Riders will probably be able to break him. Morathi's other snipe spells, though, with Marie's Dispel Magic scroll, are not able to get through. She does get a single Spirit Leech through on Sir Michel, but only does a single wound to him. The shooting phase is a much nastier one, with the repeater bolt throwers and the crossbowmen firing at the Knight of the Realm unit on top of them. They do enough damage to reduce the unit to just a single model, which panics and flees. A turn later, we remembered that we'd actually forgot about the Ice Shard Blizzard, and my opponent extremely sportingly allowed me to place one of the Knights of the Realm back in the unit, because it was that Ice Sharded Bolt Thrower that did the bulk of the damage. This piece of sportsmanship wasn't just token, because having 2 knights left enabled the realms to rally on a subsequent turn, where they were then able to keep out of trouble for the rest of the battle and preserve their points. In the combats, the Knights Errant are easily able to bring down the Medusa, and very fortunately for me, Sir Gaston slays 3 Dark Riders that charge into him, meaning that he's able to win combat by 1, thus nullifying that Doom and Darkness. I neglected to say that that dragon managed a long-bomb charge on the rightmost trebuchet and crashes it to pieces in the combat phase. Before it did that, it actually tried a charge on the Grail Reliquary, which failed its terror test, and that bounced through a trebuchet and off the board. That's a minor disaster there, because that's a fortitude-bearing unit gone. In Bretonnian turn 2, I charge the Dark Shard unit with Sir Michel, who manages to get in and he skewers the level 1 sorceress. However, the remaining Dark Shards do stick, and it takes Sir Pierre to come in there later and finish them off. The main issue for me here is to work out how to deal with this Witch Star and this Executioner unit in the couple of turns I've probably got left before that Red Dragon gets here. Things do get a bit easier because the Green Knight manages to come on again at the second turn of asking, and I run one of the Knight Errant units up in front of the Witch Star to chaff it. In the magic phase, I'm able to get a Net of Amitok off on the Witch Elves to try and stop them moving. But the really crucial moment comes in the combat phase. So, Gaston slaughters the remaining Dark Rider who's holding him up, and the Executioners take a panic test on a 10 rerollable, and they fail it. Now, while this seems like a disaster for my opponent, the Executioners flee away from Gaston through the Witch Star, which doesn't panic them because they're frenzied, and they pop out on the other side facing my units. In Archie's next turn, he's able to rally that unit, and they're there stuck in front of all of my knight units and in front of the Witch Star. In a sense, the Executioners have actually just provided a wall, which makes it even more difficult for me to deal with that big Witch Elf unit. So in a sense, that running away wasn't actually a bad thing at all for the Dark Elves. Now, the remainder of this game was very intense, and I don't have a lot of photographs from it, so I'm going to have to describe. So, the Witch Elves were able to overcome the Net of Amitok and spend a turn repositioning themselves, and they arranged themselves to face the White Knight Errant unit in front of them. At the time, I was perfectly fine with something that looked like the Witch Elves simply chaffing themselves. However, Archie absolutely gave me the slip there, because in a subsequent turn he barrels the Cauldron of Blood out past my skirmish screen into the Grail Reliquary to go for the objective. My position is now looking extremely ropey unless the Grail Reliquary can survive that Cauldron charge with that Death Hag on top, who I find out later has got the Ogre Blade and all manner of extra attacks. Morathi manages to destroy Sir Pierre with a Fate of Buna. But at the top of the battlefield, the 2 repeater bolt throwers are defeated by my 2 loose knight units. In the combat phase, the Reliquary manages to stand up to that awesome pummeling by the Cauldron of Blood, but it can't pass its break test and runs. In the next Bretonnian turn, that Grail Reliquary fails to rally on a 9 and runs off the board. It's really going to be do or die now, because now I'm losing the objective unless I destroy those executioners. So I let them have it with everything I've got, which is 2 Knight Wedges, the Green Knight, the Grail Knights in the back, and also Sir Gaston from the side. You would think I'd be pretty confident of this, but my level of certainty of how I do in combat, even when I get great flank and rear charges, has been severely shaken in the last 3 games. In the combat phase against the Executioners, I managed to get off Curse of the Midnight Wind, and this means that they're reduced to killing just a handful of knights. Then when I come to attack, the knights don't disappoint me and wipe the Executioners out just to the Standard Bearer, who dies when they break and flee. Now of course those Witch Elves behind now no longer have the Cauldron of Blood in them and so are a lot more chargeable. However, by sandwiching the Executioners in that way, I've blocked the vast majority of my knights from overrunning. However, the man that can is the Green Knight, and he careers forwards and crashes into the side of the Witch Elves. I'm also able to overrun with Sir Gaston on the top, who smashes into the side of the Cauldron of Blood. I'm optimistic there might be a major late game swing here to the Bretonnians, and to head that off, Archie takes the decision to charge Morathi into the side of the Green Knight. Now, Morathi of course has a magic weapon, in fact 2 magic weapons, which she uses to inflict BDSM on her victims. Anyway, suffice to say this gambit doesn't work, and the Green Knight's generic armor save protects him from the vast majority of damage. For his part, the champion of Bretonnia uses his Dolorous Blade to rend apart around 4 Witch Elves, so he's able to win the combat. I think if Archie had challenged with Morathi there, this would have been a rather different story. For his part, Sir Gaston is able to do enough damage on the Cauldron of Blood to break it and run it off the board, the first time he's made good use of his Tress of Isolde. In the final Bretonnian turn, the cavalry arrive, and we're able to smash the remainder of the knights into the Witch Elves, and this time we beat them by an absolutely thumping margin. They both test on double 1s, and the Witch Elves are run down by Ripance's knight unit, and Morathi is destroyed by the Green Knight. That's a big late game swing to the Bretonnians, winning me the objective and destroying both Dark Elf infantry units. On the peripheries of the battle, Chantal has bunkered up as far as she can to the side of the battlefield, and the dragon tries a final long bomb charge on her and can't quite make it. This late stampede from the Bretonnians ended up carrying them to a 19-1 victory, which of course is not really at all representative of how the game went. It was actually a very close game where we were really dancing on a pinhead right at the end. I should say that Archie was a fantastic sportsman. He was very happy to really rush through the final Bretonnian turn when he knew that I was going to get a very good charge on his Witch Elf unit. Competitively, obviously this was an excellent result for me against a very powerful opposition, and I'm not really sure I deserved to win the game as much as I did. But quite frankly, after yesterday, I'll certainly take it. So my final game is once again against Tomb Kings, and I'm playing Brennan, who is a smashing guy who I had a beer with the night before. So this is Brennan's army, and it's centered around 2 very large infantry formations, a block of 60 skeletons with spears and a block of 40 Tomb Guard. Aside from that, I don't think that this list is that much of a problem for me. He's got a War Sphinx, he's got a Necro Sphinx, he's got some Skeleton Archers, some Carrion, a Hero Titan, a Casket of Souls, and 1 squadron of 3 chariots. The army is magically supported by Catrap, who is a special character from the Tomb King army book, who is essentially excellent at casting the Lore of Nekara. But the big news here is that Brennan doesn't have a Kenric Titan, something I'm very grateful for. The setup is the diagonal one, where both sides start 18 inches apart. And the objective is the 2 penny scenario, where you have to capture these 2 penny pieces that are on the tabletop centre line. Now, after these are dropped and set up, I realise I've got a very big advantage in this game. It's really the first really good matchup that I've had in these 5 rounds, and the scenario makes it doubly so. While one of those objectives is right there in front of the Tomb Guard in the middle of the battlefield just to the left of the Grail Reliquary, I've been able to put the other one on the far left flank. You can just about see it there represented by a coin on the bottom left hand side of the battlefield. That one is going to be very, very easy for me to get, especially because there's a hill in front of it which is going to conceal my Grail Reliquary's advance. All Brennan has really to challenge that objective is a squadron of 3 chariots, and I really should be able to charge that off with one of my Pegadins. As far as the one in the centre is concerned, sure, that's going to be more problematic, but I think I'll be able to pack the centre with enough knight units to be able to outscore that Tomb Guard unit. Also, I think that the terrain in this battlefield really favours me. There's not only that hill in the bottom left-hand corner, but there's also this rather fetching Buddha statue in the middle. This is really useful because it means that his 2 infantry regiments won't be able to mutually reinforce each other. So Brennan only has a relatively small number of drops, and because of this, I think I'm able to rather out-deploy the Tomb Kings. Both of those infantry regiments stick on the centre, which they were really always going to have to do, and then I'm able to put most of my army on the 2 flanks. What I intend to do is run round the back of the Tomb Kings to go for his casket, go for his skeleton archers, and go for his hero titan. Also, he's probably going to have problems with the Green Knight as well, who also is going to pop out behind him. There's very little shooting in this list and very few magic missiles, and the army is really rather slow. I ought to be able to outmaneuver this force quite easily, and simply avoid those 2 infantry slabs, because there's plenty of points elsewhere. For spells, Chantal gets Comet, Harmonic Convergence, Curse of the Midnight Wind and Uranon's Thunderbolt, and Marie gets the ever-useful Net of Amitok and Shem's Burning Gaze, which we can use to do extra damage against the undead. In Tomb King turn 1, Brennan pushes up quite aggressively, knowing full well that he's going to be outmaneuvered if he doesn't close on me quickly. One quite interesting piece of aggression is to push up those 5 skeleton horse archers in front of Chantal's unit. In the magic phase, rather little is done. The Tomb Kings do get quite a few spells off, but they're mainly just buffs and debuffs, with me saving my dice to stop the Casket of Souls. In Bretonnian turn 1, I'm in a position to push on the right flank, running up the Grail Knights and also a Knight Errant unit round the side of the Necrosphinx. On the left flank, that's a little bit more difficult, and I'm having to stay put with most of my knights, who fortunately all passed their impetuous tests. What I'm going to try and do is destroy that chariot block and then advance on the objective with my Reliquary. Then that left flank will be exposed and my knights will be able to run round it. But we can't quite set off on that quest yet. I fly Michel over the chariots and face them in the side, hopefully meaning that they won't be able to get out of his charge arc, because these things are pretty slow. I move up my Reliquary in front of the Necrosphinx meanwhile. Brennan's very welcome to charge that, because I think it'll stick and then I'll be able to charge it in the side with one of my knight blocks. I also take the decision to run Repants out of her unit and essentially stick her behind the statue where she stays for most of the game. The reason I like this is because she can't really be seen, and that gives her the maximum aura for her BSB rerolls, which are going to be very important in this game to stop my Knights Errant failing impetuous tests. My magic phase is really rather a good one, and I haven't had too many great magic phases in this tournament. Marie manages a Shem's Burning Gaze on the Carrion and completely wipes out the Undead Chaff unit. Meanwhile, she also gets a Net of Amitok on Catrep's unit, which is going to be nasty because Brennan's going to have to pass strength tests to fire, move, or to cast magic with his main spellcaster. In the shooting phase, one of the Trebs hits the Tomb Guard and brings down 5 of them. The only bitter part of the pudding is the Green Knight once again fails to come on in the first turn, as he has in 4 of the 5 games. In Tomb King 2, Brennan actually manages to get out of the charge arc with his chariots, using a musical reform to be able to slide forwards in a way I hadn't anticipated. Nonetheless, they're going to be taking a charge from the Grail Reliquary in the next turn. His only charge is the Necrosphinx into the Grail Reliquary that I placed in front of it. The Pilgrims pass their terror test, and in the combat phase, the Necrosphinx fails to do much damage to it, just bringing down a few battle pilgrims, and the doughty monks manage to chip a wound off it in reply. It ends up sticking, and so that Necrosphinx is going to be taking it with a knight unit in the next turn in the flank. Now, Catrep is able to cast spells overcoming the Net of Amitok, but nonetheless the Tomb Kings don't do anything of great significance in the magic phase. Mainly they're putting in buffs so that their archers can multi-shot and some of their units become unchargeable. The multi-shot archers do fire a lot of shots, but Brennan is unlucky with the dice and they're not able to do anything. In Bretonnian turn 3, that 3-man Grail Knight unit charge into the archers that failed to damage them. This is probably going to be a long grind out here. For his part, the Green Knight pops out of the hill and puts himself in a place where he threatens the Casket of Souls, the Hero Titan and Catrep. On the left-hand side, the Grail Reliquary makes a charge on a 5 into the side of those chariots, who are looking rather doomed, with Gaston staring at their rear. The only spillage of Bretonnian gravy is a knight-errant unit failing its impetuous tests, and it ends up deciding to charge the Battle Cat. In fact, I send a second unit in with them, but it doesn't get in. In the magic phase, Marie continues to torment Brennan with the Net of Amitok, casting it on the Skeleton Spear unit. The combat phase goes well in my favour, and the knight-errant units smash off the Necro Sphinx and completely destroy it. They do a cute reform into a line to get out of the charge arc of the Tomb Guard, although I leave the Grail Reliquary sitting in front of them. The Battle Cat, meanwhile, proves a tougher proposition, and the Knights Errant only damage it once and beat it in combat by 1, leaving them to grind it out with it in subsequent turns. Against the Chariot, the Reliquary rather messes it up and actually loses combat by 1 despite charging and being in the side. Against the Skeleton Archers, the Grail Knights kill plenty, but the Archers slit a bony dagger through the visor of one of the Knights and bring him down. In Tomb King turn 3, Catrap's in trouble because the Skeleton Archer block is engaged with the Grail Knight, and he's got the Green Knight and Sir Pierre both round his back, and another unit of Knight Errant bearing up the side to boot. Brennan tries 2 ploys in the next 2 turns, first using the Hero Titan to chaff the Green Knight, and then second, rather hilariously, using the Casket to accomplish the same thing. The Tomb Kings are able to get the Light of Death off in the magic phase in a double 6, but unfortunately Brennan rolls a rubbish score on the Pilgrims, and that isn't enough to panic them. The Tomb Guard meanwhile smash apart the Reliquary in front of it, but the Bretonnians have got plenty more chaff where that came from to keep the elite regiment occupied. In the next Bretonnian turn, the Pinchers continues to close round the back of the Tomb Kings. Marie has to deal with the Skeleton Spearmen on her own and plonks herself right in front of them and yet again casts Net of Amitok on them, something she continued to do for the rest of the game. Brennan does get a little bit of a bounce back though, because that Battle Cat manages to stamp all over the Knights Errant and defeat them. However, very soon afterwards it ends up with Paladins in both its front and its back as Michel and Pierre try to destroy it. Gaston meanwhile has destroyed that 3-man chariot block, leaving the Grail Reliquary to sit on the objective and flying into the Tomb King's centre where the points all are. As you can see, I've got Knight units on 3 sides of the Tomb Guard unit. I've got one in front for it to charge off, my Knight of the Realm unit there hanging on the side, and my Knight Errant unit in the rear. Amusingly, Repance parks herself sideways in front of the Knight Errant unit to stop them getting any ideas with their impetuousness and charging the back of the skeletons. The Green Knight, meanwhile, chops apart the Casket of Souls, and the radio for talking to God explodes in a choral discord of heavenly music. This symphony is too much for Gaston, who explodes, and the Green Knight also takes 2 wounds. Catrap, meanwhile, is hanging on by his fingernails, putting himself behind the skeleton unit to prevent those knights charging into him. However, he's literally cornered on 3 sides, and in the next Bretonnian turn, one of the Knight Wedges thunders into the front of the Archer unit, and that, combined with the very resilient Grail Knight unit, manages to destroy that unit and overrun into Catrap, where he is swiftly impaled. The closing turns don't see an enormous amount of action. The cat is eventually brought down by the 2 Pegadins who are in its front and its rear, although it does put up a very steely fight and it takes 3 combat rounds to eventually destroy it. Apart from that, the Tomb Guard realise that they're outnumbered on top of the objective by the Knights Errant behind and the Knight of the Realm by the side, and so they decide to just take the piece of chaff that's on offer in front of them and destroy that Knight Errant unit. For their part, the Skeleton Spearmen are still being tormented by the Net of Amitok, and in the Bretonnian turn 5, both trebuchets land mighty rocks on the Skeleton Spearmen, shattering no less than 35 of them in a single round of shooting. That shooting enables my Pegadins and also a single Knight unit to thunder into the Skeleton Spearmen in my turn 6, and we do enough to bring them below 25% and score some points for them. This game ended a 16-4 victory for the Bretonnians. The Tomb Kings did kill some things, and so they weren't absolutely clobbered, but I think that this game was very much in my favour from the beginning. There was very little Brennan could do about my speed, and I was very easily able to wing my way to the back and chip off the vulnerable HQ that was behind these 2 infantry formations. I was really able to ignore or chaff both of these, something I wasn't able to do in the objective where I had to hold the centre against a relatively similar dwarf kind of setup. And with the conclusion of that game, the dust settled on the Cardiff Crusade Tournament, and Chantal's Bretonnians were left to ponder what had gone right and what had gone wrong. So, in the final analysis, when the points were totted up, I ended up coming 9th out of around 50 players. Certainly a very respectable showing, given the disaster I suffered on day one. However, sometimes these rankings don't tell the whole story, and in a sense I think this rather flatters me, because I was never really competitive in this tournament after around Game 3. A hard taskmaster might say that a couple of thumping wins on lower and middle tables elevated me to a respectable position overall. However, of course, I should add the caveat that I'm talking about this from a competitive standpoint, because I think that makes for interesting viewing. Of course, the vast majority of players, and me very much included, go to these tournaments primarily to have fun, but I've been playing this game long enough now to find the competitive aspects of it very interesting, and that's why I'm so interested in using Bretonnians, who are of course a very challenging army to use. Needless to say, I thought it was a fabulous tournament once again, and I had a smashing time in all 5 of my games. I absolutely loved the liberty of 3-hour rounds, which not only allow me to play a more innovative multiple smaller units list, but also give me time to take a lot more photos than I would when the rounds are shorter. Warhammer is such a magical game, not just because of the lore and because of the history, but also because playing it, and I think playing it competitively, gets you pumped up like nothing else, and it makes you really care. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't help remembering, and sometimes even dreaming, of some of the key moments that made these battles turn the way that they did. That's something to me I really enjoy. I really like remembering games of fantasy in posterity, and that's why taking photographs, and indeed making these reports, allow me to really write a history of what happened in games that years later I would really like to remember. When you play stuff online, including games of Warhammer on simulations like Universal Battle or Warhol, I just don't really remember those games even though I enjoy them at the time. But many of these games will stay with me for years, and a few will probably stay with me forever. As a matter of fact, I'm such a fan of these tournaments that I've decided to put my money where my mouth is and help organise one myself, which will be happening in London on the 29th and 30th of April in 2023, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what a tournament looks like from the other side of the fence, when I am an officiator and an organiser rather than a player. Anyway, let's just close out this video by reflecting with Chantal on what happened to her muster of Bretonnia in these games. Well, I think the unescapable and rather depressing conclusion is that the multiple smaller unit Bretonnian army, for all its originality and innovations, didn't really work compared to a more traditional long lance style list. 3 of my 5 games were extremely difficult matchups, featuring large blocks of infantry that even a long lance Bretonnian army might have struggled with, but would have had a significantly better chance. I think Mike's Dark Elves in Game 2 were a reasonable matchup for my multiple smaller unit Bretonnian list, but Mike's such a good player that he obviously made the game very difficult. The only really easy game I think I had, vis-a-vis the matchup, was the last game against Tomb Kings, where I was able to outmaneuver them and take advantage of the fact that I could outmaneuver them by securing the objective easily and blowing up the Tomb King HQ. The thing is though that 5 games isn't really a large enough end number to draw any strong conclusions, and that's why it always keeps you guessing. That said, I think there was enough evidence here for me to be rather doubtful about the ability of this army to perform well on a reliable basis. I felt most of the time as though I was swimming against the tide, and even the games I did well in and the moments in the battles that I won, I felt that I needed to either be very lucky or very clever to achieve something that perhaps I would have been able to achieve more easily with a different kind of list. In that regard, I think this was really the final experiment that I wanted to perform with Bretonnians, a multiple smaller unit list and also Grail reliquaries, and it was a very interesting experiment, but not one ultimately I can say was particularly successful. At the end of the day, there's still something of the great and legendary Nigel Stillman in Bretonnians, who of course wrote the 4th edition army book. Stillman advocated, in a legendary column in White Dwarf, that a true Bretonnian should not vary his army, that he should keep his list the same and let the only surprises be his tactical decisions, his deployment and his strategic moves, and that when he won, with his army, with 3 coats of gloss varnish, the brilliance of his generalship would be beyond doubt. A high ideal indeed, but perhaps one with more than a little truth, for even in 8th edition there aren't too many variations you can perform with this army. The moral, I think, is just play better and pray to the lady. And like the Green Knight, even if you fall once, you can come back again. Right, let's close out with a little review of the units in my list. So, Chantel, first and foremost. I don't think she had such a great time of things at this tournament with her Heaven's Magic. Generally, I wasn't magically that successful in any of my games. She got a single OK Comet of Cassandora, a single OK Harmonic Convergence, but most of the rest of the time she was confined to casting Ice Shard Blizzard. She also blew herself up against the dwarves in the 3rd game at a point where there was nothing my opponent could do about her, and entirely due to me, managed to get herself killed quite a few times. As far as Marie, her understudy, was concerned, I really liked her performance on the Law of Light. She only really shone out in the 5th game against Tomb Kings with her brilliant Net of Amatok, but I felt I had more flexibility with light magic than I did with beasts, and so when I am allowed to use that, that's what Marie will bring to the table. The 3 Pregadins had rather contrasting fortunes. The hero was undoubtedly Sir Michel, and his Wormlance was absolutely amazing. He toasted large numbers of enemy infantry in I think 3 of my 5 games, and generally was the most resilient and fought the most crucial combats in these battles. He managed to kill the Dark Elf Supreme Sorceress in Game 2, and also performed some vital manoeuvres in Games 4 and 5. Sir Pierre was useful support, but Sir Gaston rather spooned some of his opportunities. He had a fantastic opportunity to kill Ungrim, a fantastic opportunity to kill or break that thrice-cursed Dreadlord, and the only real one he managed brilliantly was against that Cauldron of Blood. Overall, it's an expensive build, the Virtue of Knightly Temper and the Tress of Isolde, and it is a little bit of a gamble if it doesn't go your way. As for Repants, she was only a very modest kind of build, but she supported well and lent some extra weights to those Knight Wedges on the charge. As for the Knights, I think that was probably the area where my army performed the worst, which is never a great look for Bretonnians. Those Knights Errant were very unreliable, and in the 1st game, those impetuous tests really lost me it. To be honest, I think this multiple smaller unit army might do better with Knights of the Realm rather than Knights Errant. The Realm Knights aren't impetuous and have leadership 8. However, they are more expensive, and so you would really have to drop one of the units to convert your army from Errants to Realm. As for the Grail Knight, small 3-man unit, that got into some brilliant positions in the games. I just don't think it was very lucky with the dice, except on the last one. I think in all of the battles it managed to get great flank or rear charges, and so, you know, on another day, perhaps they could have been a real star. I have to say though, of all my knight units, when they got into great positions, they didn't really deliver the goods. I do think I rolled quite badly with them a lot of the time, but clearly, had I got longer lances into the positions I got these smaller lances in, I think I probably would have broken opposition that otherwise held. That being said, I'm still not convinced about the invalidity of this philosophy, because sometimes with long lances you end up winning combat by a completely unnecessary margin, and sometimes I can't help thinking that small lances with the devastating charge we're allowed to use might be able to do the job, and so even on the basis of this evidence, I'm still not convinced the core philosophy of this army was wrong, even though the knights didn't really do well on this occasion. Those 2 Grail Reliquaries though were excellent. I've used them in practice games where perhaps they were even better than they were in these tournaments. They did fail a few rather crucial break tests, but they did also pass some as well, and they were very resilient and very difficult to chip away. I shouldn't over-egg the pudding. They are probably one of the worst units in Warhammer Fantasy, but they're probably not as bad as people think when you run them in that innovative dart formation. As for the Green Knight, he only turned up on the first time of asking in 1 of the 5 games, which given it's on a 3-up was pretty bad. But when he was on the table, he was excellent. He got into excellent positions, performed roles of chaff, did quite a lot of fighting in some of the games, was instrumental against the Dark Elves in Game 4, instrumental against the Tomb Kings on Game 5. In Game 2, by appearing behind the Warlock Star, he made Mike overrun, which gave me that great chance that I wasn't able to take to break it, which would have undoubtedly won me the game. Even in the other two games, he was also very useful against the Dwarves and against Adam's Tomb Kings in the first. I think this was the Green Knight's best ever performance in a series of 5 games, and he was really helped by having these 5-hour rounds which enabled him to come back to life, and he wasn't taken casualty in any of the 5 games. Finally then, it's the Trebs, and I literally haven't hit with a trebuchet for nearly 18 months, but in this tournament they hit far more often than they should have done. They didn't really perhaps do the damage that they would have done on another day, with a few ones in bad places, but nonetheless they were excellent, and that made the infantry formations much more chargeable than they otherwise would have been. As a matter of fact, I actually changed my scatter dice before this event. I got this really small green one before that I'd been using for around 18 months, and then I realised that that rather coincided with the time my Trebs stopped hitting, and I replaced it with a standard GW scatter dice, and now suddenly they've started hitting again. Interesting. Anyway, that's a wrap folks, and I hope you enjoyed that 5-part tale of competitive chivalry from the old world. There's no new silverware for the King's trophy cabinet, but I trust he's not going to be too harsh on Chantel. After all, there's plenty of great material for the bards on the streets and in the courts of Bretonnia. Tally-ho, and good night.